Not just the threat of climate change that makes this film so important. It is the way it explores and unveils a critical episode in American history. For me, the brilliant combination of personal stories, political economy, and agroecology deepens our understanding of the complex reasons why the Dust Bowl happened and how the nation responded. There are many stories of resilience here and of government assistance through the WPA and Farm Security Administration. But the film also reveals the ugly side, the prejudice against the Okies, labor exploitation, and the beefing up of borders. The film illustrates the vital importance of seeing the Dust Bowl in historical context. Although one of the commentators in the film says the Dust Bowl is a story of a generic humanity pushing up against nature, I believe the film actually goes way beyond this simple binary to identify the powerful political and economic actors involved in this unnatural disaster. In the past, the Dust Bowl has been mapped, sometimes unwisely, onto other places and times. For example, in the 1930s, British colonial authorities in East Africa used the American Dust Bowl and fears of soil erosion to negatively interfere in customary and sustainable patterns of African land use. So how do we take the rich history Ken Burns has given us here and apply it wisely to the present and the future? That is the subject at hand.
I thought it would be interesting to think a little bit about the history of droughts in relation to the Dust Bowl era. And it turns out we have various ways in which we can look back in history and determine when these droughts have occurred. And actually, the Dust Bowl drought was a period when conditions in the Pacific Ocean were rather cool, what we call La Nina conditions. You've probably heard about El Niños, when it's warm in the eastern equatorial Pacific. During the opposite condition, when it's cold, you get displacement of the storm tracks so that the normal path of storms across the United States is displaced. It's kind of a big arc of the moisture, which is pushed out of the Great Plains area. And these things come and go on the average, maybe every 6 or 7 years. But occasionally they last a bit longer, and occasionally they are more stronger. The conditions are stronger. And then we flip back to an El Nino type condition where we have more moisture. The storms whip across Texas and Oklahoma, and they bring back moisture. And as we saw in the film, the good conditions followed by the drought, and then the good conditions return, the wet conditions return. Now we go back in history, we see this alternation of droughts and so on. But there was something particularly unusual about the Dust Bowl, and the latest research suggests that the Dust Bowl itself became such an intense event because the natural vegetation had been destroyed, that the dust itself created its own artificial climatological condition, and actually amplified and enhanced the normal progression of drought that had not happened to such an extent as we had seen in previous episodes. And so we had another drought in the 50s. It wasn't quite as severe. We've had droughts since then, and they haven't been as severe. Now, fast forward to the present, and here we have a situation which, as Ken pointed out in his film, is a semi-arid area. It's a vulnerable area anyway for agriculture. And so natural fluctuations push us across the line one way or the other. Now, if we look at the present situation, where we're putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we're changing, the human activity is changing the climate, and underneath that change, we've still got these natural fluctuations going on. And so we can imagine that we might, by changing the climate, either aggravate or ameliorate the natural variations. It turns out that in the very area that we've been looking at in this film, all of the climate projections, all of the model simulations of the future suggest that this is truly going to get worse, that it is an area that is going to receive less rainfall, that is going to get warmer. And what I find particularly ironic about this, the political dimension of this. If you look at the political representatives from Oklahoma, these are the die-hard politicians led by Jim Inhofe, Senator Inhofe, who absolutely refuse to accept that global warming is even real. He's the guy who said that global warming is the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people. And so here's a guy who is sitting in the very epicenter of where future climate will change, in an area which has clearly, obviously been extremely vulnerable to climate change, and he refuses to even accept the notion that this is a vulnerable region, not only from drought, but of course it's also the epicenter of extreme weather. There's more tornadoes in Oklahoma and northern Texas than anywhere on the planet. And we know that the more energy the atmosphere has, the more energetic these storms become, and it's likely that there'll be more tornadoes in the future. So I think there's another interesting dimension to this, is why is it that people who should be especially sensitive to these issues of natural climate variability and future climate change due to human activity simply refuse to even acknowledge that possibility. And I think I mean, I can speculate on my own view of this, since Oklahoma is also one of the major oil-producing locations in the country, that these representatives are truly not representing the people, that broadly speaking, but the special interests that are represented in those areas. So I think that's another interesting aspect of this. We will have future droughts, there will be La Niñas going forward, and they will be aggravated by the natural climate changes that we're inevitably going to see.
Listening to this film and the kinds of details that are there, such as, you know, my mother took flour sacks and formed them into these, put them over our faces. These little artifacts and things that connect, you know, this natural disaster or unnatural disaster to human beings, right? And what kinds of ways were they fashioning ways of survival out of what was surrounding them. And the flour sacks for me is a really interesting moment, because in talking to people who grew up in the 30s in my own research, flour sacks often come up. You know, it's this product that was in some ways a reflection of their poverty, but actually they would often refashion them into, in some cases, clothing, underwear, in some cases. So I wanted to thank you for that. As far as the historical implications, I think the main one would be the visibility, right, of you know, our farm programs, the agricultural economy. How do we get to a point where agribusiness looks and operates the way it does today? And I think for a lot of Americans, and also talking to students, it's very mysterious. Even the notion of a family farm is not very filled out. Again, it's maybe photographs. Students are familiar with music or Farm Aid, maybe, but there's a way in which it's hard for people to really sort of get involved in this discussion and this debate without any kind of real sense of farming, these farm programs, and the role of the state, right? And so all of these are in your film, but they're in the film in very human ways, right? Particularly you all heard the FSA mentioned, the Farm Security Administration, and it's one of those agencies which is shockingly absent from American historical memory. We know the photographs, but most people know very little about The Farm Security Administration, right. So, you know, my immediate reaction is that hoping that there's an increased literacy and the relationship between the land, decisions about farming. You know, there's a lot in here about agricultural science. And I think there's one of the interesting stories here is how do agricultural scientists formulate opinions on what needs to happen, and then how do they actually implement those policies, right? And then what's the relationship between these scientists and farmers, right? How is there some sort of relationship and some sort of democratizing of these relationships? And one of the things that I wanted to just point out in your reading of history, because you're going to leave here and you're going to do all this research on the Dust Bowl, is to think about the writing of history and all these photographs that we have, and start to think about who's being represented and how are they being represented. If you read something about farming in the 30s, how are poor farmers being represented, or how are farmers who are struggling being represented, and who speaks for them? One of the issues that comes up with the photos, right, is we talked in our class about agency a few weeks ago. And so I think that this film with the interviews, which are fantastic, you get a sense of how, as Betsy mentioned, the borders of states, you know, are become sort of militarized. And so you have this issue where Americans traveling across borders, it becomes very dangerous, they become criminalized. At the same time, you've got relief agencies participating in the deportation of a large number of Mexican Americans, and we're not exactly sure of the numbers. But there's a way in which this film sort of brings together all of these really critical issues, which are unfortunately very present today, right? So my main reaction would be that, you know, in watching this film, hopefully you pay attention to the details, because the people who are interviewed in this film, you know, really take the time, right, to craft these really specific memories that tell you an awful lot. And they're not just a good story, but they really kind of get at some of the critical lessons, I think, in watching this film, so.
As a geologist, I'm a bit more comfortable looking at the depths of time than I am the depths of people and their emotions. The Dust Bowl was at least catalyzed by drought, as Ray said, and as the movie showed. There were many other factors that were involved in that much worse. Drought is a normal part of climate. It's a normal part of the climate variations. And as Ray said, it's involved with ocean temperatures and this El Nino, La Nino cycle. Now you get a drought in one part of the world and another part of the world is going to get more rain. And so it's this constant fluctuation. And many areas are adapted to those droughts that we've seen, those 3-year droughts, those 5-year droughts, 10-year droughts. And even our civilization, we've grown and developed the capabilities in many cases to deal with the droughts on that scale. What we haven't recognized and haven't adapted to very well are much bigger droughts. And geologists, Ray and Larry Winship and others have done this kind of work looking at tree rings and have told us a lot about droughts over the last thousands of years, much deeper time scale, deeper perspective, and there have been droughts far more serious than the droughts of the 1930s. There have been droughts in California about 1,000 years ago that lasted 120 years. Rainfall was perhaps half, or stream flow was about half of what it is today. 120 years of drought, not 3 years, 5 years, or even 10 years, but 120 years of drought. Many of the big lakes off of the Sierra Nevada mountains had dried up. Trees were growing and those lake beds, and then when the rains came again, those trees were buried, and those trees are what they've used to study the occurrence of these droughts. There's been droughts in Africa. Remember, droughts occur all over the world, and think about the Dust Bowl in this case, but there are droughts everywhere. China has experienced extensive droughts in its wheat basket and its farmlands. Africa is continually suffering from droughts. So droughts occur, and there's good evidence that there have been much more severe droughts in the past. Even here in New England, some of the tree work has showed, they had a 400-year record of tree rings and showed that the last 100, 120 years or so has been relatively benign as far as rainfall variations have been. And prior to that time of settlement, there's been some pretty severe droughts that would probably really upset our infrastructure, our food growing capabilities today if they were to occur again. And there's no reason to think they won't. We should expect that those types of cycles and that occasional rare but extreme drought will occur again. In the last 20 or 30 years, the climatology is showing us that the big continents are drying out. North America is drying out. Africa and Asia, parts of that are drying out. There's a drying trend. Part of that's due to reduced rainfall, part of it's due to increased evaporation, and part of it's due to global warming. The air and the atmosphere warming up, it can hold more moisture and it sucks that moisture off of the land. Well, before I get to the future, Jim Hansen, one of the NASA climate scientists, had a paper out recently, and he looked at the past 30 or 40 years of climate or so, I guess 1950 to 1980, or looked at how the recent decades have been compared to the 1950s to the 1980s. And it's a very distinctive shift in the kinds of weather that we get now. What used to be very rare warm events are now becoming commonplace. He describes this as the climate dice. The dice are loaded. It used to be if you rolled dice, you'd sort of have equal chance of hot, cold, or average. Now that dice, 4 sides are hot and 2 sides are normal, and there is not a side for cold. You roll those dice, you're much more likely to get hot. That's what we're living in today, and everything is telling us that it's likely to get worse. So we have those trends of natural droughts, some that have occurred in the past that are far more severe than we've experienced in the last 100 years or so, plus this trend of warming, drying out. Rain, when it comes, may often be more intense rainfalls, which runs off faster, is less likely to replenish the soil. So it doesn't look good in terms of the future. I think we have learned some lessons from the Dust Bowl. That exact sort of thing won't happen again. But I don't think we've seen the end of climate refugees, either within our borders or on an international basis. So this movie, this film, will be, I think, a great chance for all of us to look at that, think about the Dust Bowl situation, but also expand our knowledge of how things are different now, how things might have been different, were different in the past with those mega droughts, and really open our minds to what the possibilities are and how to forestall those or how to prevent those from occurring again.
Ecclesiastes says, what has been will be again, what has been done will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun, which might be a pretty good way to think about all of these stories, all of the things you've said. I think central, Amy, is this notion of, for me, narrative. And for too long, I think the Academy has rejected, for understandable reasons because of its fragility, the efficacy of narrative as a way to communicate complex things. But the basic DNA and building block of human communication of any form is story. Even those who have completely rejected narrative, at least intellectually, forget that they tell stories in every single gesture that they make to another human being, and even indeed to themselves as they construct a scenario that keeps, as Clarence Beck would say, the wolf from the door. I mean, we construct narratives for daily purposes, we construct narratives for poetic and transcendent purposes, and we construct narratives just to make sure we don't go crazy because of the randomness of events. And what I've learned in the last 35 years is that narrative contains, if done properly, it is susceptible to the Jim Imhoffs of the world, who are essentially story distorters, and they see only one aspect of it. But those carefully constructed narratives carry with them complex information that is allowed to understand the sort of through line of making panties out of those cotton sacks, which is a huge scene here. The way in which a portion of the country, Oklahoma, which we think of as singularly red, I mean, it is the only state in the Union in which Obama in 2008 did not win a single county. Even with two relatively large metropolitan areas, he did not win a single county in Oklahoma. And yet at this time, this fervently conservative, independent area yielded in the face of the realities of the Dust Bowl and surrendered to government intervention, actually begged for government intervention, actually asked for a power to declare martial law as their neighbors weren't following Howard Fennell's plan of the Soil Conservation Service to plow a certain way, to use the old type of plow, to rotate crops, to accept the notion of not planting the same crop in every place all the time, to return things to grasslands, to be paid not to do. All these ideas that were sort of thrown out in the New Deal in an attempt to solve the larger economic problems, but also the specific problems of the Dust Bowl. It was very interesting that at some point one imagines that Imhoff will be you know, sort of a devil figure frying in hell as Oklahoma now struggles to beg for the kind of assistance that they will inevitably need to right their ship in the course of this. And while I can't take as long a view, I remember that Muir used to describe the Grand Canyon as a grand geological library. That is to say, as if each layer, as we know, the Precambrian schist that's 1.7 billion years old, that's revealed by the persistent action of the Colorado River, and all the layers are this wonderful, wonderful history that is only recently human. We have the opportunity in our stories to kind of unite and rescue that, which is why I've always, as a filmmaker, attempted to take whatever subject it might be and try to tell stories, human stories that have direct connections of people, knowing full well, having full confidence in the ability that those stories will bring with them all the other kind of configurations, the ones that are political and human, racial, class, poverty, geological, with them. And that in the onrush of stories, you have the possibility of containing all of those things, contradictory things to be sure, complicated things, disgusting things, difficult things, joyous things, transcendent things, but narrative was the way in which you could reveal, as William Blake the poet said, the universe in a grain of sand, or in this case, in a speck of dust. So thank you all for your patience.
Thanks so much to Ken, and thank you to the panelists. And